Welcome to the 2016 Symposium on St. Thomas Aquinas, sponsored by the Joyce McMahon Hank Aquinas Chair in Catholic Theology, made possible through the generosity of Joyce McMahon Hank, St. Mary's class of 1952. Before introducing our speaker tonight, I want to say that I was just informed that at 7:30 there will be a National Weather Service test of a very loud siren very close by. So unless there is an extraordinary coincidence, that will be not an emergency. Just to alert you ahead of time. The so-called problem of evil is one of the most universal religious questions, and certainly among the most vexing in our time, as in Thomas's. Already in the second question of part one of the Summa, Aquinas cites the presence of evil in the world as an objection to the existence of God. There follow 510 more questions composed of roughly 3,000 articles in as many pages, which at the least should indicate to us the answer Thomas himself came to about the existence of an infinitely good, all-powerful God, in spite of humanity's universal encounter with evil. But good in what sense? In particular, is the Creator bound by moral obligation and standards of right conduct that may lead to the conclusion, when evidence of natural or, as we've just tragically seen in Belgium, human evil be adduced, that somehow God isn't doing what God ought? Or does the very admission of moral obligation on God's part already cross boundaries Aquinas is elsewhere at pains to respect in distinguishing the Creator from the created? And if yes to that, does that mean that in the end we are reduced to mouthing pieties in a language we cannot truly understand, if and when we affirm with St. Thomas that, quote, by the word God we understand a certain infinite good, close quote? There may be few Aquinas scholars writing today who are more qualified to address these seemingly intractable questions than our speaker tonight, Father Brian Davies, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Fordham University, where he has taught since 1995. Professor Davies is the author or editor of several books on Thomas Aquinas, among them The Thought of Thomas Aquinas, Aquinas in Introduction, Thomas Aquinas on God and Evil, the Oxford Handbook of Aquinas, co-edited with Eleanor Stump, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, a guide and commentary, and the forthcoming Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles, a guide and commentary. Accompanying these are scores of articles, translations, book chapters, reviews, and edited volumes on both notable Christian thinkers and significant issues in the philosophy of religion. Moreover, all fans of the late Father Herbert McCabe are in our speaker's debt for the volumes he has produced as literary executor of McCabe's estate, many of which concern Aquinas and the place of reason in Christian belief. As was McCabe, Father Davies is a model of clarity, wit, accessible prose, and dedication to their brother Dominican, St. Thomas Aquinas. Tonight's lecture has been literally years in the making. Some here may remember last year's cancellation due to extreme weather around Aquinas' January 28th feast day. As a result of both prudence and old-fashioned and old-school Catholic creativity, we are reestablishing this lecture series in March in memory of the March 7th feast day Thomas had until 1969, when, with little foresight and absolutely no regard for South Bend winters, it was moved to January so as not to fall during Lent. So from here on out, among all the things you give up for Lent, Thomas Aquinas will no longer have to be one of them. After the formal portion of Professor Davies' remark, we'll have some time for both dialogue through question and answer, and then more informal conversation at the back of the room around food and drink. But first, please help me welcome to St. Mary's Professor Brian Davies to speak on St. Thomas Aquinas on God and evil.
Well, let me thank Professor Angela for that nice introduction, and let me thank St. Mary's for very graciously during the last 24 hours or so. May I say that I'm not usually as unpunctual as I seem to be today. I'm a year and a bit late for this lecture, but that I put down to an act of God rather than to my own negligence. Let me also say that when the siren goes in 25 minutes or so, feel free to use it as a providential excuse to flee the building. So it's often said that evil is a problem for those who believe in God, since it casts doubt on God's existence. In this sense, the problem of evil was sharply raised by David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion. Now, there is a handout to go with this lecture, which has some quotations on it, and here's the first quotation from Hume. Hume says, "Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence, then, is evil?" Now, Hume is suggesting that evil in the world suggests that there is no good and powerful God. Yet Aquinas doesn't agree with that conclusion. And this evening, what I want to do is briefly to explain how he approaches the topic of God and evil philosophically. Let me say that I'm only intending to give an account of Aquinas' philosophy of God and evil. And I'm not going to try to evaluate it, nor am I going to try to talk about what Aquinas thinks about God and evil in the light of what he takes to be Christian revelation. Trying to do all that would leave me having to speak for much more time than I have, though I'd be happy, of course, to turn to matters of evaluation and Christian revelation in the question and answer session following the lecture. So, to start, I should note that by evil, Aquinas means badness of any kind at all. Now, we tend to use the word evil mostly when referring to extreme badness. So, we naturally allude to genocide as an evil, but we don't speak about a mild headache being so. And yet, Latin, the Latin language, has only one word to serve when it comes to calling anything bad. That's whether slightly or greatly. This is the word malum. So Aquinas' discussion of God and evil, these are all discussions about God and malum. They're concerned with what is bad to any degree. Now, Aquinas, of course, was writing before Hume, but he anticipated some questions that Hume raises, specifically concerning evil and God. And you can see that by noting one of the objections that Aquinas introduces in question 2 of the first part of his Summa Theologiae. The objection runs as follows, and it's quotation 2 on your sheets. Here's Aquinas raising an objection. He writes, "It seems that there is no God. For if one of two contraries were infinite, the other would be completely destroyed. But by the word God, we understand a certain infinite good. So, if God existed, nobody would ever encounter evil. But we do encounter evil in the world, so God does not exist." Now, Aquinas does not accept that line of thinking, but he knows about it. How does he try to deal with it? He does not do so in the way that philosophers who believe that God exists typically do so today. In saying that, what I mean is that Aquinas does not engage in theodicy. Now, by theodicy, I mean an attempt to show that God can be exonerated for permitting evil. More precisely, I take the theodicy to be an argument of some kind designed to explain how all the evil that has ever occurred can be squared with the claim that God exists as both omnipotent and good. Even more precisely, I think of a theodicy as an argument intending to show that God is morally justified in allowing all the evil that has occurred. Proponents of theodicy typically try to do what John Milton said he was up to in Paradise Lost. That is, to assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. Theodicists effectively proceed as if they were counsel for the defense in a legal trial. They take their client to be God, and since it seems obvious that there is and has been a lot of evil around, they conclude, or rather they concede, that there is apparent evidence against their client. Yet, they deny that God should be convicted of being badly behaved. The evidence, they claim, is only apparent. God, they say, has impeccable moral reasons for permitting evil, reasons that should leave us concluding that God is both all-powerful and morally good, even though evil is a fact of life. Now, how do proponents of theodicy think that God can be defended? One popular line of argument is usually called the free will defense. According to this, much evil is brought about by human choices. But, say exponents of the free will defense, God is not to be blamed for this evil. On the contrary, God is to be praised for it. Why? Why so? Because, the argument runs, human freedom is a great good, and because the occurrence of moral evil is due to this good, and in no way due to God, except by way of morally justified permission. On this account, God has given people freedom to make choices. In that case, however, God has to put up with the choices that people make. And in doing so, he is no more to be criticized than our parents, who, at a certain point in time, recognize that their children have become adults and give them space to do their own thing, even if that thing turns out to be regrettable. Yet, of course, not all that we take to be evil is the result of what people choose to do. People do not choose to bring about devastating earthquakes or tsunamis. So how might one exonerate God for permitting things like these? Various answers to this question have been given, but they all tend to boil down to the suggestion that such evils are necessary means to certain goods. Hence, for example, it has been suggested that we would not be able freely to do great good or great harm if it were not for evils that occur in the world of nature and are not anyone's doing. Why not? Because, the argument goes, we would not know what good or harm we could do if there were no naturally occurring evils of the kind with which we are all too familiar. Then, according to another line of thought, naturally occurring evils provide us with opportunities to rise to heights of moral virtue, opportunities that give us the chance to become morally mature. As I've said, theodicies seek to defend God morally. You'll also, I hope, see that in the case of the free will defense, the idea is that God can be thought of as somehow and rightly backing off so as to allow certain creatures to act independently of God. Yet, as I have said, Aquinas does not engage in theodicy. I think that he has various reasons for not doing so, but chief among them is his view that God should not be thought of as a moral agent in the first place, meaning that God should not be thought of as something either morally good or morally bad. But if Aquinas thinks that, what can be his take on God and evil? If Aquinas does not engage in theodicy, what can he mean by saying God is good? And what account can he give of God's causal role when it comes to evil? Now, in turning to these questions, I need to say something about what Aquinas thinks about God in general. And the first thing I should note is that Aquinas maintains that we do not know what God is. Aquinas repeatedly says that this is so. And we need to be clear that when he does so, he is not just paying pious lip service to some vague idea that God is mysterious. His point is that God is strictly non-classifiable, that God belongs to no genus or species, that God is not an individual belonging to a kind of which there could be more than one member, that God is not, so we might put it, a being among beings. God, says Aquinas, is non-composite and entirely simple. God, he argues, is not something with distinct properties or attributes, as are things in the world. According to Aquinas, God and God's nature are one and the same thing, meaning that all that is in God is God. Aquinas also maintains that the best answer we can give to the question, what is God is subsistent being itself. His Latin there is ipsum esse subsistens. For Aquinas, it is God's very nature to exist, in that God is pure existence, unparcelled into different ways of being. And, says Aquinas, God is the direct cause of the existence of things around which we can get our minds for as long as they exist, and not only when they begin to exist. God, he argues, is the non-temporal and therefore unchangeable source of the existence of the all-too-changeable spatio-temporal world, however far it extends and for however long it exists and has existed. Now, of course, many people who believe in God speak in a way quite different from Aquinas. They say, for example, that God is a person, or that God exists alongside the universe as a center of consciousness of some kind. Yet Aquinas never talks about God in this way. His view is that God is the creator of the universe, meaning that God accounts for there being something rather than nothing at all. That God is the cause of there being anything whatsoever to pick out and understand. For Aquinas, if you like, God and the universe do not add up to 2. In his view, in Aquinas' view, our ability to add things up depends on them having some nature in common, even if only notionally. We can add to a collection of dogs because we are adding a dog to the collection. Or we can add things up under a description like, say, things that I asked for from Santa Claus, or things I noticed on my way to work. But Aquinas denies that God can be listed together with anything else in this kind of way, since he does not think that there is a real distinction between God and God's nature, as there is a distinction between, say, being a dog and being an existing and nameable dog. You might suppose that Aquinas would at least concede that God and everything other than God add up to a definite number of beings. Yet Aquinas thinks that the phrase "is a being" does not tell us what something is. Along with Aristotle, Aquinas holds that there is no such class of things as things that simply are. So he denies that we can add beings together while simply thinking of them as beings. In short, Aquinas thinks of God as accounting for the fact of there being any countable beings for as long as any of them exist. Now, by anything countable, I mean something definable or classifiable, something existing in a context in which other things exist. Hence, for example, we find Aquinas denying that God is in any familiar sense a being. God's will, he says in one place, I'm afraid you don't have this on your sheets, in one place he says God's will, quote, is to be thought of as existing outside the realm of existence, as a cause from which pours forth everything that exists in all its variant forms. Now, as I've said, God for Aquinas is not seriously a being among beings. And it's with thinking about God such as that in mind that, as I've said, Aquinas does not countenance the idea that God is a moral agent whose moral goodness one should try to defend by means of theodicy. First of all, Aquinas does not think of God as a moral agent, since he does not think of God as a member of a kind, of which there could be more than one of that kind. Secondly, though, Aquinas does not think of God as a moral agent because of the way in which he thinks of moral agents in general. Taking his lead from Aristotle, Aquinas takes moral agents to be human beings whose moral goodness, if they've got it, consists in them having the classical cardinal virtues of justice and temperance and prudence and courage. These, for Aquinas, are the classical cardinal virtues. But Aquinas thinks of these virtues as what people need in order to flourish as human beings. So he does not think of God as having the cardinal virtues. And since he also takes virtues to be dispositions or tendencies, Aquinas doesn't think of God as being actually or possibly virtuous. For dispositions or tendencies play themselves out in time, while Aquinas holds that God is not temporal but eternal. For Aquinas, God has no dispositions. You might, of course, think that moral goodness can be displayed not just by people having the cardinal virtues, but also by people who do what they are duty-bound or obliged to do. You might think that the key concepts in thinking about ethics should be duty and obligation. You might say, for example, that I exhibit moral goodness by doing my duty so as to turn up to teach my university courses on time. And yet, although the notions of duty and obligation enter into Aquinas' account of moral goodness, Aquinas doesn't think of God as morally good, even in this sense of morally good. And that's because he doesn't think of God as working in a context in which he can be thought to have obligations or duties of any intelligible kind. Why not? Well, because of Aquinas' view that God is the creator, the maker of all contexts. For Aquinas, God has no role or job to live up to. To think otherwise, he believes, would amount to being committed to some kind of idolatry, to failing to note that God is not a creature, not part of the spatio-temporal world. If Aquinas thinks along these lines, though, how can he possibly suppose that God is good? Now, in spite of what I've just been saying, Aquinas does indeed hold that God is good. Why? Why does he do so? Or rather, why does he do so on philosophical grounds? And in response to that question, I need to start by trying to explain what Aquinas takes the word good to mean. His view is that the word good is what some philosophers call a logically attributive adjective. Logically attributive rather than logically predicative. Let's bring it down to earth a bit. Consider the sentences, X is a wooden desk and Y is a big mouse. The first, X is a wooden desk, tells us two distinct and equally intelligible things about X. That it is a desk and that it is wooden. But the second sentence, X, Y is a big mouse, the second sentence, that doesn't tell us two distinct and equally intelligible things about Y. It doesn't tell us both that Y is a mouse and that Y is big, since the significance of the word big depends on what one is talking about. Hence, for example, while I seriously understand what X and Y are, if told that they are both wooden, made of wood, I don't, in the same sense, know what they are if told that they are both big. After all, a big mouse is vastly different from a big elephant. And there'd be something very wrong with an argument that ran, X is a mouse, X is big. Any mouse is an animal, any mouse is a big animal. And, thinks Aquinas, that the word good works as terms such as big do. He thinks that good does not signify some distinct property had by all good things, as wooden signifies a distinct property had by all wooden things. For Aquinas, the meaning of good is context or noun dependent. In Aquinas' view, any number of things can be referred to as good, but not because they share some distinct property, as do things that are wooden. There are good books, good teachers, good students, good schools, good colleges, good opera singers, good doctors, good parents, good detectives. There are good all sorts of things. But, thinks Aquinas, what makes them good differs from kind to kind. When we praise a book as being good, we are not thinking of what we had in mind, Aquinas thinks, when we praise a teacher as good. Again, when we commend someone for being a good opera singer, we're not thinking of that person having what we focus on when commending someone for being a good parent or a good lawyer or a good accountant, and so on, Aquinas thinks. In his view, therefore, goodness is, in a sense, relative. Yet, Aquinas thinks that goodness is also objective, that various things really are good, whether we recognize this or not. And he thinks that this is so because he holds that different, though different good things might be, they are all somehow attractive. Something is good, he says, insofar as it is desirable. Quote, direct quote. Now, let's go back to God is good. Aquinas doesn't think that God is good can be construed along the lines, God is a good such and such. For Aquinas, there is no class to which God belongs so that we can think of him as being a good instance of things of that kind. But Aquinas does think that God can be thought of as desirable somehow. And in doing so, he reasons, as I have it laid down on 3 on your sheets, in 3 on your sheets. This is cutting the long argument short, but he argues all things desire their perfection. Their perfection is what things are drawn to. Then he argues the perfection of different creatures exists in God, since God is their maker who produces them so that they have the natures that they have. It's fortuitous that you are now reading instead of listening to me. Then he argues, in tending to their perfection, creatures are therefore tending to what is in God before it is in them. Do you want me to stop for a moment or just plow on? Hands up, shall I stop or carry on? So Aquinas holds that goodness in creatures exists because of God making creatures to be what they are and causing them to exist for as long as they exist. And working with the thought that you can't give what you haven't somehow got, Aquinas thinks that creaturely goodness must somehow reflect what God is. Aquinas doesn't think of God as containing creaturely goodness, as, say, a bottle contains water, nor does Aquinas think of God as exhibiting creaturely goodness as creatures do. His point is that goodness in creatures is a dim reflection of what exists simply and undividedly in God, since God is what is making creatures to exist, since they derive all that they are and all good that they aim at from God. Yet, Aquinas does not say that evil reflects what God is. And that for 2 main reasons. The first is connected with his understanding of the meaning of the word good. The second has to do with his view of divine causality. As I've said, Aquinas takes something to be good insofar as it has desirable properties or attributes, considered as the kind of thing it is. So he thinks of there being goodness as there being something actually there that we want to be there or look to find there. But he doesn't think of evil in the same way. At one point, he writes this, it's 4 on your sheets. 4. He says, like night from day, you learn about one opposite from the other. So, you take good in order to grasp what evil means. And it goes on to say this. He says, we have accepted that the word good means whatever is desirable. Well then, since each real thing is drawn to its own existence and completion, we have to say that this fulfills the meaning of good in every case. Therefore, the word evil can't signify a certain existing being or a real shaping or positive kind of thing. Consequently, we're left to infer that it signifies a certain absence of a good. Now, in other words, Aquinas thinks that X is bad only and always means that X lacks some degree of goodness. That X's badness is a matter of privation, and not a matter of badness existing as some kind of positive substance. So Aquinas thinks, for example, that if we lament about somebody being blind, we are focusing on the fact that they lack the ability to see. Again, he's thinking that if someone is morally bad, that person lacks virtue. Now, you might perhaps suppose that that point of view commits Aquinas to the conclusion that evil is an illusion, or something that does not exist in any sense, but Aquinas certainly does not think of evil as an illusion, nor does he deny that evil exists. His view is that many things are genuinely in a bad way, and he thinks that the sentence, evil exists, makes sense, since it captures that fact. Many things are in a bad way. On the other hand, Aquinas doesn't think of evil as a substance or a positive reality in a substance. He thinks that I am a substance, but he doesn't take evil to be a substance as I am. He thinks that I actually have darkish hair, but he doesn't think of my suffering from evil as a matter of any such positive attribute being present in me. Aquinas thinks of evil in entirely negative terms, as what there is when we have a gap between what something is and what something needs to be, so as to be good in some way. And I should note that the gap in question here is one that Aquinas takes to be something that might arise because of what we might call a presence rather than an absence. I mean, he thinks, for example, that my computer might be in a bad way, not only because it lacks a working part, but also because someone might have poured wine into it, as I often have. So Aquinas holds that we do not know what God is, and that God is no more a moral agent than is my cat, and that God is good as being the unfathomable source of all creaturely goodness, and Aquinas thinks evil is always a lack of goodness of some kind. He holds to all of those positions. Now, what does Aquinas think of evil in the light of his belief that God is the creator of everything other than God? Let's bring God back into the equation now, okay? As I've said, Aquinas agrees that evil can be said to exist in some sense. As I've also said, he holds that God is what makes the difference between there being something rather than nothing. So, is Aquinas not therefore committed to supposing that God somehow causes evil? In order to answer that question, I need to note that Aquinas, as some of you know, distinguishes between two kinds of evil. There is, he says, both what I'm going to call evil suffered, and there is, Aquinas thinks, what I'm going to call evil done. And the Latin term for these are malum pene, I'm translating as evil suffered, and malum culpe, which I'm rendering as evil done. Aquinas takes evil suffered to amount to evil that is not anybody's doing. So, for example, Aquinas would think of me as a victim of evil suffered if I, say, become sick naturally and not by human malice. On the other hand, though, Aquinas thinks of evil done as definitely ascribable to people. So he would say that there is evil done when I, for example, choose to murder someone or wrongfully abuse them in some way. And it is with respect to evil done and evil suffered that Aquinas discusses the question, how does God stand causally when it comes to evil? You might put this by saying that when it comes to God's causality and evil, Aquinas focuses on what many people would refer to as naturally occurring evil and moral evil. With regard to evil suffered, Aquinas' view is that this is caused by God, but only indirectly and never by being willed as an end in itself. As I've said, Aquinas maintains that as causally accounting for the existence, the sheer existence of anything created, Aquinas is taking God to bring it about that something exists. So, since Aquinas thinks that victims of evil suffered certainly exist, he takes it for granted that God is causally accounting for their being victims of evil suffered. Yet, he does not think that the evil in evil suffered is any kind of substance. In keeping with his general account of evil, Aquinas holds that there is evil suffered only insofar as something is lacking an appropriate good of some kind. For Aquinas, there is evil suffered only inasmuch as there is a lack of goodness. And Aquinas does not think that a lack of goodness is something creatable. So he denies that the evil in evil suffered is creatively brought about by God. In this sense, Aquinas thinks of the evil in evil suffered as brought about by God only indirectly. More precisely, Aquinas' view is that when there is evil suffered, this is always because there is some concomitant good that God is directly bringing about. So, for example, were he around today, I think he would say that my suffering from, say, malaria is due to the flourishing in my liver of certain mosquito-borne parasites. When I have malaria, these parasites are doing well at my expense. And, thinks Aquinas, this doing well is being created by God, since it exists and involves no privation of goodness in the parasites, causing me to suffer from malaria. In other words, Aquinas' view is that evil suffered always has a scientific explanation and is always to be accounted for in terms of one thing doing well at the expense of another. Actually, his argument is that when it comes to evil suffered, God is causing nothing but what is good. On the one hand, thinks Aquinas, God is causing the goodness in what causes evil suffering. On the other hand, though, Aquinas also thinks that God is causing what goodness there is in the victims of evil suffered, the victims. Aquinas is clear that victims of evil suffered are indeed in a bad way. At the same time, he argues that as long as these victims continue to exist, they possess goodness to some degree. His view is that even an ailing human being has to exhibit the goodness required for there to be a human being, since even an ailing human being is still a human being with enough human goodness to leave it existing as a human being. But when it comes to evil done, when it comes to what he calls malo culpae, Aquinas takes a different line altogether. And that's because he does not think that there is ever any concomitant good when it comes to evil done. At this point, I should perhaps note that Aquinas' approach to evil is entirely what I might call non-consequentialist. I mean, Aquinas thinks that there is evil done when someone makes morally bad choices or commits sin, but he does not think that one has to have brought about bad consequences in order to have made a morally bad choice or to have sinned. Aquinas is prepared to factor consequences of actions into an evaluation of people, and would, for example, deem someone committing genocide to be morally worse than someone, say, stealing a $1 bill. But Aquinas also holds that one can exhibit evil done, that one can be morally bad, even if one manages to have no bad effect in the world. Suppose, and this is horribly too topical today, suppose that I make a smart bomb, and suppose that I put it in a place with the intention of blowing up a large chunk of Chicago. Suppose I do that. But now, also, suppose that the bomb fails to explode, as I intended it to do. Would the fact that I did not manage to kill people mean that I did not exhibit moral badness when planting the bomb? Well, Aquinas thinks no. No. For him, the evil in evil done is attributable to the agent who makes morally bad choices, not in what the agent manages to bring about. For Aquinas, evil done is in the agent. It's not in the consequences of an agent's actions. Correspondingly, Aquinas thinks I might be morally impeccable, even though I do something that happens to do great damage to people or other things. He thinks, for example, that I might be morally blameless should I happen unwittingly to shoot my friend while aiming at a bear about to pounce on her. So for Aquinas, the evil in evil done is only in the doer, and the bad consequences of evil done amount to evil suffered. In that case, though, Aquinas concludes that evil done involves no concomitant good. He doesn't think that my evil actions are due to the action of something flourishing in its own way, as I display an absence of goodness. For Aquinas, evil done is pure privation of goodness with no accompanying good to account for it or to absorb it, as it were. It is, for Aquinas, a dead loss. So, Aquinas goes on to argue, evil done can't be thought of as something created by God. Just follows for him, it's not creatable. It's not something that can be at the end of God's activity of making to exist. As with the case of evil suffered, Aquinas does not take the evil in evil done to be a created substance. So he doesn't take God as making it to have created being. Instead, he argues that it only has a cause in the agent who displays the evil of evil done. And he thinks that this agent causes the evil of evil done only by failing to act as he or she ought to act. For Aquinas, the only acting cause when I exhibit the evil of evil done is me not acting as I should. It lies in me paying attention to certain goods while turning my back on or ignoring other goods to which I should be attending. In effect, for Aquinas, it lies in human freedom. Yet, haven't I said that Aquinas has no time for the free will defense, which is, as I've said, often employed as a way of morally exonerating God in some way? Well, indeed, I have said all that. I have said that Aquinas has no time for the free will defense, and I've explained why Aquinas rejects the free will defense. But am I not now just reporting Aquinas as smuggling the free will defense in by the back door, so to speak, when he talks about the evil in evil done? Now, I don't think that I am, because we need to know now what Aquinas has to say about the questions, is God a cause of sin, and does the human action of sinning come from God? We need to look at those questions at this stage. And Aquinas' answer to the first question, is God a cause of sin, is no. But, interestingly, you may think, his answer to the second question, does the human action of sinning come from God? To that question he says, yes. God can't be a cause of sin, Aquinas argues, since, in Aquinas' own words, it is not right to say that God causes sin in himself or in anything directly or even indirectly. And then he goes on to say what you find in quotation 5 on your sheets. He says, sin is by definition withdrawal from the order of things which has God as its purpose. For his part, God inclines all things and draws them to himself. Hence, he cannot withdraw either himself or another from an order of things which has itself as its centre. So he can't directly cause sin, nor can God indirectly cause sin. It can happen that God withholds his help, and that without this help one falls into sin, but God ought not to be blamed when somebody sins any more than a pilot should be blamed when a ship sinks, even except in the case when the pilot could and should have been at the helm. Therefore, in no way whatsoever can God be called the cause of sin. Now, the idea there seems to be that God is good and therefore cannot cause to exist what is intrinsically bad. Aquinas also, though, seems to be saying that though God might not make me a saint, it is not his job to make me a saint. The captain of a ship has a job to do. Yet Aquinas can make no sense of the idea that God has a job to do, as does the captain of a ship. And the reason he can make no sense of this idea is because he does not think of God as a thing in the world with a way of acting, rightly or wrongly, that is determined by the circumstances in which it happens to exist as a being among beings. And yet, Aquinas, as I've now said, also holds that the human act of sinning comes from God. Now here's what he says in defense of that position. It's 6 on your sheets, quotation 6. The act of sin not only belongs to the realm of being, but it is also an act. And from both of these points of view, it comes from God. Every being, regardless of its manner of existence, must be derived from the first being. Every action is caused by something already in act, because moving another to act presupposes that the mover has the power to act. Every being which is in act depends on the first act, that is God, as to its cause. Therefore, insofar as a thing can be called an action, God is its cause. But sin is called a being and an action only in the sense that something is missing. And this missing element comes from a created cause, that is, the free will in its departure from order to the first agent, who is God. Accordingly, this defect is not ascribed to God as its cause, but to the free will, even as the defect of limping is due to a crooked leg as its cause, but not to the motive power, which nevertheless causes whatever there is of movement in limping. Accordingly, God is the cause of the act of sin, and yet he is not the cause of sin, because he does not cause the act to have a defect. Now, I take it that what Aquinas is saying in that text is that God is operative as creator even in our sinful acts. God, thinks Aquinas, may not be able to make evil to exist as a substance or positive reality, but, Aquinas holds, God acts in every operation, whether of nature or of things with will. If that's the case, though, is Aquinas not committed now to theological determinism? It's the obvious question to raise. Is he not committed to the view that God forces us to do all that we do, and that we can never act freely, given the creative causality of God as making all things from nothing? Now, you may think that Aquinas is so committed, and yet I'm sure he would not agree with you for reasons that he gives in several places, including his commentary on one of the works of Aristotle. Now in that work, he singles out a particular argument for discussion, and I give you this argument as quotation 7 on your sheets. This is from Aquinas' commentary on Aristotle's Periphermenias. We read, if God's providence is the cause of everything that happens in the world, it seems that everything must happen the way it does. Firstly, because God knows it and his knowledge can't be mistaken, so what he knows must necessarily happen. And secondly, because he wills it, and his will cannot be ineffective, so everything he wills, it seems, must necessarily happen. Now, in reply to those arguments, Aquinas says what you find as quotation 8 on your sheets. This is his reply to that line of thinking. He says, these objections, and I hope to say this picks up with the earlier part of my lecture, these objections, he says, depend on thinking of knowledge in God's mind and the working of God's will, on the model of such activities in us, when they are in fact very different. When it comes to God's will, Aquinas argues, this can't be thought of as imposing necessity on things, since God, as well as being outside time, is also outside the realm of creating things, some of which come about of necessity, he thinks, while others do not. Aquinas draws on his idea that God is not a being among beings, but rather the source of all creatures, only some of which operate as determined by other things, or as necessity by them. So quotation 9 on your sheets where this thought is coming to the surface. He says, what can be and what must be are variants of being, so that it is from God's will itself that things derive whether they must be or may not be, and the distinction of the two according to the nature of their immediate causes. For God prepares causes that must cause for those effects that he wills must be, and causes that might cause but might fail to cause for those effects that he wills might or might not be. And it is because of the nature of their causes that some effects are said to be effects that must be, and others effects that need not be, although all depend on God's will as primary cause, a cause which transcends this distinction between must and might not. Now, perhaps I might paraphrase that quotation from Aquinas by saying that its main point seems to me to be that God, if you like, makes no difference to anything, even though God accounts for changes that creatures undergo. I quite like the phrase, God makes no difference to anything, as encapsulating a key element of Aquinas' notion of God as creator. As I've said, Aquinas takes God to be the creator, and he takes this conclusion to mean that God accounts for there being something rather than nothing at all, at any time. But he recognizes that this conclusion commits him to the further conclusion that for God to create something is not for God to tinker with it or modify it somehow. Aquinas thinks that God creates something not by changing it, but by making it to exist, simply making it to exist, though not out of anything. And it's with that conclusion of Aquinas in mind that I say that his view is that in a serious sense God makes no difference to anything. For Aquinas, God as creator makes the difference between there being something rather than nothing, not the difference in a thing between its being first like this and then like that, though Aquinas does think that God accounts for changes in created things. So Aquinas doesn't think of God's creative act as interfering with anything so as to render its behavior determined or necessitated. He thinks that God, the creator, makes things to be whatever they are. And he also thinks that some creatures are what they are of necessity, while others are not. In short, Aquinas' view is that we are free, not in spite of God, but because of God. And why does Aquinas think that we have freedom? Well, for fairly familiar reasons. Aquinas thinks we have freedom because he thinks that the reality of human freedom is taught by the Bible. He also takes the reality of freedom to be confirmed by philosophical reasons that don't depend on prior religious belief. He thinks, for example, that we sometimes act freely because we have the ability to recognize alternative scenarios and to reason in the light of them. And he also thinks that if people lack freedom, then there can be no such thing as moral philosophy and no justification for praising or blaming people from a moral perspective. So Aquinas finds there to be no contradiction in believing both that God exists and that evil exists, for all the reasons I've just been trying to explain. Yet, unlike proponents of theodicies, he makes no attempt to show that God is morally good, even though evil is a fact of life. Instead, he argues that God exists and that God is good, though not a good such and such. And he argues that evil is no proof of God's badness, since it is not a created substance, since it often arises because of the presence of concomitant good, and since evil can be ascribed to people who settle for lesser goods than they should. All of that, I think, means that insofar as Aquinas recognizes there being something to be called the problem of evil, it's a problem about why God has not created more goodness than there is. Aquinas certainly thinks that God could have done that. He thinks, for example, that God could most certainly have made a world in which there are many more flourishing things than there actually are. At the same time, however, Aquinas does not think that God has an obligation to create more good than there is, any more than he thinks that God has an obligation to create at all. Now, is Aquinas right about all of that? Well, much here, of course, will depend on what you take to be the value of his account of God being entirely simple and transcending the world of spatial temporal things as their creator. Of course, that's an issue. But that's matter for another lecture, and I've reached my time more or less exactly, and in spite of the siren.